Spies, top-secret technology, and an all-American hero. The U-2 spy plane incident was the quintessential Cold War story, and it rocked US-Soviet relations for decades. The Lockheed U-2 spy plane was developed by the CIA to provide high-altitude photographs of secret Russian military installations. On the 9th of April 1960, the first mission returned with images of a nuclear test site and air bases. The Soviets detected the flight and made a diplomatic protest. President Eisenhower forbade any further flights without his personal permission. However, on May the 1st, he allowed pilot Francis Gary Powers to fly another mission to photograph intercontinental ballistic missile sites. But the Soviets were waiting. They captured both Powers, who bailed out of his aircraft after losing control under anti-aircraft fire, and the wreckage of the spy plane. After losing touch with the aircraft, the Americans believed it had crashed into Soviet territory, taking the pilot with it. The Russians were delighted. With its high-tech spy flights and refusal to abide by international treaties, the Americans had been getting the upper hand. Now the Russians held all the cards. Khrushchev kept quiet about his catch, allowing the Americans to make public statements claiming the aircraft had been making weather observations for NASA and even rolling out a U-2 in NASA insignia so the media could take photographs. A few days later, the secret slipped out when the deputy foreign minister was overheard talking about the pilot's interrogation. Khrushchev quickly issued a public statement saying, "I must tell you a secret. When I made my first report, I deliberately did not say that the pilot was alive and well. And now just look how many silly things the Americans have said." The Soviets shocked Americans by parading pilot Gary Powers as a captured spy. Much of the U-2 had crashed to Earth intact, and they even had photographs from the spy plane that proved it was spying on Soviet territory. Items salvaged from the wreckage included rubles and women's jewelry, intended to help the pilot if he landed in enemy territory. The aircraft and its contents were put on display at Moscow's Gorky Park to humiliate the Americans. Gary Powers went on trial for espionage, a huge and very public event. Some Americans criticized him for cooperating with Russian authorities during his interrogation. However, the CIA's instructions were clear. If capture appears imminent, pilots should surrender without resistance and adopt a cooperative attitude towards their captors. With Powers' concerned family looking on, a Russian court found him guilty of espionage and sentenced him to 3 years imprisonment, followed by 7 years hard labor. Returning from Russia after the trial, Powers' father told reporters he'd been relieved to find his son safe and well. He said it had been a tense and exhausting time, but the family was happy to see their son, and he appreciated the courtesy and consideration shown by the Russians. But telling of his son's one modest request, Oliver Powers broke down.
Once again, he didn't ask us for anything specific. He said he needed warm clothing for winter.
Finally, 2 years after Powers' capture, there was a breakthrough.
Francis Gary Powers has been released from prison in the Soviet Union and turned over to American authorities early this morning in Berlin. Frederick L. Pryor, an American student held by East German authorities since August of 1961, also has been turned over to American authorities in Berlin. The president has commuted the sentence of Rudolf Abel, who has been serving a 30-year sentence in federal prison following his conviction in 1957 on espionage charges. Mr. Abel has been deported and has been released in Berlin. Mr. Powers will shortly be en route to the United States. He will have an opportunity to meet privately with his family and will be interviewed by appropriate United States government officials.
British-born Soviet spy Rudolf Abel returned to Moscow and his family wrote Powers' parents a letter of thanks that was published in a Russian newspaper. Oliver Powers was delighted and relieved that their ordeal was finally over, but said he hoped his son would consider a career change when he returned home.
How do you feel about the exchange itself?
I feel great about that exchange. I think it's a very good deed.
What are your own views about flying at this point? Would you like to see him do any more?
I'd rather he'd quit that and not get above the second story.
Powers' wife, Barbara, was equally happy.
Oh, well, you just don't know. It's wonderful.
Mrs. Powers, how did you first get word this morning? What form did it take?
Well, a representative from the president called me. He told me that my husband was on his way home. And I almost fell out. I was so happy.
Was this the first word that you had had?
Yes.
Well, this then came as a complete surprise to you.
Oh, my goodness. I just cried for joy, and I still am.
Powers was interviewed by a Senate committee when he returned, which found he'd behaved in an exemplary fashion and acquitted himself as a fine young man under dangerous circumstances. Powers died in 1977 in a helicopter crash, and 40 years after the U-2 spy incident, his family was presented with a Prisoner of War Medal, a Distinguished Flying Cross, and a CIA Director's Medal. Today, the remains of the U-2 wreck can be seen at the Central Museum of Armed Forces in Moscow, a permanent reminder of one of the most riveting episodes of the Cold War.